Welcome back to The Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel, and this is a podcast where we journey chapter by chapter through C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. We are currently in between seasons, and today I am joined by Lina Maslo, the author and illustrator of Through the Wardrobe, How C.S. Lewis Created Narnia. Welcome to the show, Lina.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I am really excited for you to be with us. You have a great book that is about to come out, and actually I think by the time listeners are hearing this, it will already be out, and I'm so excited to talk to you about it today and to also, at the end of the episode, point listeners in a direction where they can also read this too, because it is really a phenomenal book.
Well, thank you so much. I'm glad you liked it.
Well, I'd love to ask you just a couple of questions about yourself before we dive into the book itself. So can you just tell me and our listeners a little bit more about who you are and how you came to love the works of C.S. Lewis?
Sure. So my name is Lina Maslo, and I'm an author and illustrator. And I actually have a degree in art, but I've always loved stories. And a couple of years ago, I came across the work of C.S. Lewis, and I saw like all of the these interesting things about him, and that inspired me to really write this book about him. And also, I'm an author and illustrator so far of children's book biographies. So I'm always on the lookout for people whose childhoods influenced their achievements. And that's a little bit about me and the book.
That's really great. I love that connection about how foundational someone's childhood is to the work they do in their adult life. I really resonate with that as an educator, and I think it's really cool that you are honing in on that in the stories that you're telling.
Right. So Through the Wardrobe, How C.S. Lewis Created Narnia is really about all of those connections between his childhood and his early life, and even in his mid 30s and 40s, all of those things, and how they came to influence the Narnia Chronicles in the end. I could maybe talk a little bit about some of those connections.
Oh, please do. Yeah, let's dive into it, because there's so many great ones.
Well, one of the things, for example, his mother died when he was 9 years old. And so that had a really big influence on his life. And you kind of see in The Magician's Nephew that is a huge topic that he covers.
Yeah, absolutely.
He also went to boarding school and dealt with a lot of bullying, and that's a topic that comes up a few times in the Narnia books, specifically in The Silver Chair. Mm-hmm. And then, he was in a war. He was in World War I, and so that inspired The Last Battle, I think. It had a lot of influence on that. But it wasn't just like bad things in his life that inspired the Narnia books. There was a lot of good things, like there was an actual wardrobe in his childhood that his grandfather hand carved. And so I include that in the illustrations. He also just loved to read fairy tales as a child, and he loved to write stories about talking animals. And that can obviously be seen throughout the books. And also just Ireland and where he grew up, I think really inspired the land of Narnia itself.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think so much of that comes out in your the book that you've written. Just seeing all of the ways. One of the things I really loved about it was it's a biography, but it's a biography written for children, and so it's not 900 pages long about his life. It's it's something you can sit down and read in one sitting as an adult, and even for children as well. And so you actually see a lot of those threads of Lewis's life come together, as opposed to reading a biography that takes weeks or months to get through. And I actually loved just how clearly you could see themes in his childhood make their way into the stories in ways that I hadn't necessarily picked up in reading biographies written by adults or for adults, because it just takes longer to read them, and so I'm not in the moment as much.
Right. And there are a couple of biographies that have like a chapter here or there that might focus on that. But like you said, most of them are just like an overview of his life, and you really kind of have to dig in there and find those threads and connections.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you've told us a little bit about the book already, and I think you might have answered some of this, but your first book was about Malala, and so that's a different shift to go from her to C.S. Lewis. And so what about C.S. Lewis? What was the impetus for writing this book?
Right. Well, although it kind of seems like there is a huge difference, between Malala, who is like the first winner of the youngest winner of the Nobel
Hmm.
Peace Prize, and C.S. Lewis, who is like this Oxford Don. Which, by the way, when I was in the middle of writing the C.S. Lewis book, Malala was accepted into Oxford, which I thought was pretty funny.
That's cool.
But they both kind of came from these very difficult childhoods.
Hmm.
And I mean, C.S. Lewis, and I call him Jack throughout the book. So if I say Lewis or I say Jack, I'm talking about the same person. Um, but even though Jack had a fairly good childhood leading up to his mother's death, afterwards he really did go through a lot of hardships, and he came out of them stronger, I think, and just without going through those things, he would have never written the Narnia stories. So I really hadn't known about him too much until about 5 years ago. And my kids were watching the Narnia movies, and I was like, these are really interesting. I kind of sat down and watched them. And I saw, to me, the underlying themes of Christianity were pretty obvious. And so I was like, I've heard of this C.S. Lewis guy before, and I've heard people talking about him, but I'd never read any of his works.
Hmm.
So I went on to read the Narnia books, and then Mere Christianity. And then as someone who just, likes to read biographies, I read his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, and a few other biographies about him. And right away, I started seeing like pictures in my mind for a book. Like I saw the connections, and I was like, this would make a really intriguing topic for a picture book, because there's just so many things that you can illustrate and as a way to show all of these connections. So I just loved all of his works, his voice and his humor, and just he's so smart too. It's just really interesting to read, everything from his space trilogy to his nonfiction and to the Narnia books.
And that's great insight, because it leads me into my next question for you, and it's one that I'm always so intrigued to hear from so many different people. So you've written this book 70 years after The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was first released. So I mean that's a long period of time. What about Narnia? What about these 7 books do you think has made them so that they appeal to so many generations of readers that you can still go buy them on a bookshelf today, 70 years after they were written?
Right. And that is kind of funny. I mean, there are actually a couple of things here and there in the Narnia books that make the characters like products of their time. Like they'll say little things here and there and you're like, what is that? But in general, I think that the characters and the stories are very universal. So again, they have to find their way through hardships and difficulties. They deal with bullying and school and other stresses. And they're able to escape some of these things and go into an imaginary world. And of course, who wouldn't want that? But the world of Narnia isn't necessarily easier than the real world. In some ways, it's harder. But the character has this ability and power to make decisions and fight for what they believe in. And I think in the Narnia world, there's also a clear distinction between good and evil. So the good is rewarded, evil is punished, but there's also a theme of grace and forgiveness. And I think it's this balance that is very comforting for people of all generations. It's very universal.
That's a really good point. I think a lot about how much, even from my own perspective, I read a lot of the books as a kid and then kind of rediscovered them as an elementary school teacher. And they resonate differently throughout different, I'm not that old, but they've already resonated with me through different parts of my life. And I just wonder how that will continue. And they seem to be the kind of books as well that you want to pass down to younger readers as well. I know I've had that experience as an educator of some books. I'm like, I have to give this to a student, or, I have to give this to a nephew or a niece. And so I think there is that kind of quality about these books that makes you want to continue passing them down.
Right. And I think for the child reader, the most important thing is that the books are fun and very entertaining. They're just these grand adventures. And you don't necessarily pick up on all of the themes, but they're just fun to read.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think sometimes we forget that, especially as adults reading these books, knowing there are so many great themes here. And I know even on our show, Phil and I will spend time, kind of unpacking things. We'll pull in a bunch of Lewis scholars. We'll talk about this, but the whole reason we're here is because the books are fun. Like, it wouldn't really matter if there were great themes if it was it's just a really dull, boring book. You're right. They're very enjoyable. They're entertaining, and they're just a blast to read.
Right. I mean, they're very entertaining. Like, you make movies out of them, and they've made like several attempts at making movies of the Narnia books, but yeah, they're just a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Well, let's move away from Narnia and Lewis for a moment. I'd love to know more about your work as an author. So you were both an author and an illustrator. So I have kind of two questions here. And the first is just, what is your writing process like for this book in particular? What was your writing process like? And then how does being an illustrator change the way you approach that process?
Well, I mean, it's pretty much the same answer for both questions because I'm doing both things at the same time.
Okay.
So like you said, I'm an author and illustrator. So the drawing and the writing is actually happening together. So as I'm taking notes for the book, I'm also sketching out ideas for certain images. As I'm writing a rough draft, I'm also making drawings. And sometimes I might even write a scene in because I want to include a certain illustration. So, for example, like very early on in the process, even before I had a rough draft written, I knew that I had this image in my mind of Jack laying in his bed as a young boy while his mother is dying. And from above, the viewer can see like this detailed rug that hints at The Magician's Nephew, which is the book that was most inspired by his mother's death. And I had that image in my mind. I made like even a finished illustration of it. It's not the exact one that made it into the book, but really there haven't been too many changes. And I just made sure to write that scene in because I knew I wanted to have that illustration in there. I also knew that I wanted to have an illustration from each of the Narnia books in this book. So I made sure to write, short little summaries, I guess, of each of the books in there. So it's just like a constant back and forth for me. There's research and a lot of reading and note taking, and then there's sketching. And then at some point I combine the two things together. So I'll take my sketches, I'll scan them in, I'll take my rough draft and sort of cut and paste the words into, like in Photoshop, and then make like a PDF book dummy is what it's called. Just to kind of see how the two things are working together. And that's when it kind of clears up a little and you're able to even revise better from there because you can see how the words and pictures are working together. Or, for example, if the text is repeating the illustration, you can cut out some of the text. So, yeah, it's just like a constant back and forth process for me.
That's really cool and really interesting because you have both of those roles. And I want to just tell you how much I loved the illustrations you're talking about. They stuck out to me. The image where Jack is in his bed and you see that carpet and you see kind of the tree and the carpet and the you see the lion and the witch down there. You see Jadis with the I think it's got the shadows of two people standing kind of in the doorway. It's beautiful. That one really stuck out to me. So I just want to tell you how much I enjoyed that. And then
thank you.
That part of the book where where Jack is writing the Chronicles of Narnia, and then you have a different illustration for each book. I adored that. It was so cool to kind of turn the page. And the first time I read it, by the time I got to Dawn Treader, I'm like, oh, I see what she's doing here. And so I was so excited to turn the page back. I wonder what I'm going to see for Silver Chair and Horse and His Boy. And it really, they were really, really great. I in particular, absolutely loved your illustration for the Dawn Treader and seeing that silver sea. It looks so beautiful.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah.
And I knew that, the people that are going to be reading this book are probably going to be big Narnia fans.
Yeah.
And I couldn't not include scenes from Narnia. I thought that was very important for this particular book. And I just wanted to do it because it was, it's just something I wanted to do also.
Yeah, absolutely. As an illustrator, was there any kind of connection to the work that Pauline Baines has done originally? Did you try to be very separate from her work? Were you trying to incorporate some of the things that she had done? What was that like, knowing that there already were illustrations for these books?
Yeah, I mean, I was definitely aware of her work
Hmm.
and I looked at it. I also, watched the movies,
Sure.
but I didn't have those images in front of me as I was sketching
Yeah.
on purpose. So, like, I knew that they were there. I looked at them once or twice and I kind of put them off to the side. I might, like, maybe look and see, like, how did she illustrate Reepicheep?
Hmm.
Um, but then I would always go back to the actual text and see, how does C.S. Lewis actually describe this scene or this character.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't say it was a big influence, but I was definitely, I'm
Yeah.
definitely aware of what she did.
You try to stay away from her depictions of Aslan because Lewis didn't like him that much. So, uh,
Right.
yeah.
Or it just, yeah, I didn't want to be influenced by her
No, yeah.
depictions. Yeah, because you sort of, as an illustrator, as an artist, you develop your own way of drawing. And you can look at other people's work, but then you sort of put it away and you put it in a drawer and you draw it how you see it. And I'm always looking at reference photos. So I'm not looking at her work, but I'm looking at, an image online of a lion and
Hmm.
drawing it the way that I would draw it. But yeah, like you mentioned, Lewis wasn't like the biggest fan of her work
Yeah.
early on, but he did eventually convert. And well, and she also, maybe went to the zoo and
Checked out a lion.
practiced a little
Yeah.
harder.
The
So-
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's great about the imagery of the Chronicles is that there, at least in my opinion, and it's just my opinion, but there really isn't like a kind of standard for so many of the characters. It's not like we all have the same picture of Lucy in our heads when we read Wardrobe, and I think that's different from some other kinds of kind of young adult or children's literature, especially in the fantasy world. Like, I think it's kind of hard. Like, for instance, most people think of Daniel Radcliffe if you think of Harry Potter now, or even with the Lord of the Rings movies, they became such a huge part of popular culture. It's hard to not think of, Elijah Wood as Frodo or something. But with Narnia, I don't get that same sense. I think because you have Baines's illustrations alongside of the BBC adaptations and then the movies, there isn't like one kind of, oh wait, that's not what my Aslan looks like. It's or that's not what my Peter looks like. There is this kind of wide variety of what we can imagine these characters to be like.
Right, right. Yeah, there are just so many, not so many, but there are quite a few versions of the Narnia stories.
Hmm.
And also, like with Pauline Bain's illustrations, most of them are black and white. And so you're sort of able to, and she did go on and color some work later on,
Yeah.
but not in the original books. And so for me, I just went back to the original source again. I did come across, a sentence where Lewis described Lucy as light-haired,
Hmm.
but he really didn't give too much description of the actual characters. So that kind of frees up the artist to, just kind
Yeah.
of go with their imagination.
So, Lina, can you tell us a little bit about what kind of research you had to do in order to write this book?
Sure. So I was actually very lucky to be able to do some traveling for this book. I didn't really get to do that with the first book. But with this one, I went to a couple of places. I went to the Marion E. Wade Center, and that's a place in Wheaton, Illinois,
Hmm.
which is a really wonderful research facility to visit for anyone who is a Lewis or even Tolkien fan. There they have the original family wardrobe that was hand carved by his grandfather. And I was able to take a bunch of pictures of it, doors open, doors closed from every single angle. And really, that's what you're seeing in my book is just like my meticulous photographs of the wardrobe that's there. They also have this wonderful like reading room where they have pretty much all of the books written about and by C.S. Lewis there. They also have a lot of papers there, letters. In my end papers, I have letters from Jack to children. And so when I was at the Wade Center, I was able to look at the copies of these letters. And actually, I copied down his handwriting.
Oh,
So
that's
the
so
handwriting
cool.
you see in the back of the book is pretty close to his actual handwriting. Yeah. And then I think the most exciting part of the research process for this book was I actually went to Ireland and England. I went to Belfast, which is his childhood home.
Hmm.
The actual house itself is not open to the public, but you can see it from the outside. But I loved Ireland for its countryside. We were there in November, but everything was still so green. It was kind of amazing. Like we went up to the mountains and there was snow in the green grass. I was like, what is this fairyland?
Yeah.
And of course it was cold and drizzly the whole time, but there's like, all these warm pubs and restaurants everywhere. So it's very homey, very beautiful. We also went to Oxford, England, visited Magdalen College, where he taught for many years, the Kilns, where he lived most of his life, Malvern College, where he went to boarding school. So at this point, I had a rough draft of my manuscript already written, and I actually already had a book deal. So I knew this book was happening.
Okay.
So I wasn't just, like
going on a
spending
vacation.
all this money on this. Right. Like I knew it was happening. I kind of knew what I was looking for at this point. And so I had my camera. I was taking pictures of, the lamp posts around his boarding school, which I have in the book, Addison's Walk at Magdalen College, where, the conversion happened and where he took a lot of walks. I took pictures there, and just all of the landscape in Ireland and England, castles and mountains and all these things. So yeah, that was very exciting. I loved the research part of this book.
That's really cool just to be able to experience so many of those things. And I really enjoyed, I want to just shout out at the end of your book, you have a section kind of more about Jack outside of the regular narrative of the story, where there's so much great information. And my favorite is the final page where you have some other, I think it's other interesting facts. Which I really love. There were so many just little nuggets in there. And the one that stuck out to me was you even talked about, which I was not aware of this, that both Malvern College and Campbell College actually both claim to have the lamppost that inspired them. I had heard that Malvern did, but I didn't know that his other boarding school was like, no, it's actually us. It's not them.
Right. And it's the same thing with the wardrobes, right? So there's a wardrobe at Wheaton College, that's the hand-carved one. But then another college, Westmont College in California, has a wardrobe from the Kilns that's more closely resembles the one that he describes in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And both of them claim to have the wardrobe. Right.
Everybody wants a piece of the pie. But I actually
I did visit both of the lampposts, and I found the one at Malvern to just be prettier and closer to what I had imagined. So that's the one I went with. So that's awesome. Sorry to the other, place.
They didn't make the cut. Did you, in the middle of this research, did you talk to any Lewis scholars, or were you mostly just reading things that had been written about him?
The one person I did get to talk to was Douglas Gresham a little bit, and it was just mostly through email. So Douglas is C.S. Lewis's stepson. So we were able to, my publisher wanted to run the final draft through him, and through the C.S. Lewis company, just to make sure, that everything was fine. And there were a couple of things here and there that we talked about. There was some other contacts that I had, but mainly I just read the biographies about him because there are so many of them. I had to pick and choose which ones to use.
That's really
and then the people at the Wade Center were very helpful. So the people that work there, when I was there, I made those connections. And so when I had questions later on, I mean, literally they can answer, anything you have, any question you have about Lewis. And if they don't know the answer, they will find it. And they were able to help me find original sources for some letters and things, and just point me in the right direction if I wasn't quite sure about something.
That's really awesome. Yeah, Phil and I got to meet both Downings, David and Crystal Downing, who work at the Wade Center last fall, and they are just some of the kindest people. And really, the work that's being done at the Wade Center is just it's such a great resource for those of us who absolutely love C.S. Lewis.
Yes, definitely. I mean, if you're doing a book about him, I think you definitely would have to go there.
Yeah.
Or at least connect with those people. Yeah. Because they are so helpful.
That's really cool. That sounds like a really wonderful experience. I'm sure many of our listeners are a little jealous that of the research that you got to do.
Yep.
Well, in the midst of this research, did anything surprise you along the way? I know a lot of Lewis's life is pretty well chronicled. Was there anything that you were like, oh, I had absolutely no idea, or that just surprised you?
There were a couple of small things. So I found out, for example, when I was at the Wade Center, and I'm sure I read this when I was researching, but I didn't really quite click, but C.S. Lewis destroyed most of whatever he wrote. So his original manuscripts, any letters that he might have received, he destroyed them. And mostly it's because he just had so many papers around him. And I think it was like his way of cleaning. But, he would get a letter, he would reply to the letter, he would throw the letter in the fire. The same thing with most of his manuscripts. And there's just like a few lines here and there from early versions of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And the only reason those were saved is because, they were on the back of some important document that Warney ended up filing for some reason or other. So that was a little bit disappointing. So like, as I mentioned, on the end papers of my book, I have letters from Jack to children in the back. And those are pretty much word for word. And then we had this idea, like, why not have the letters that the children wrote to Jack in the front? And I was like, oh, yes. And I contacted the Wade Center, and they're like, yeah, remember he destroyed everything. And I was like, oh yeah. So we actually got permission from the Lewis Company to sort of like imagine the children's letters, based on his replies. Yeah, so in the beginning of the book, the letters are imagined based on his replies to them. So, yeah, there was a little bit of imagination going on there. Another thing that was a little surprising, and this I found out from Douglas Gresham, and I hadn't really come across it in any of my work, but the fact that Jack was claustrophobic and would have never actually crawled into a wardrobe himself. I thought that was kind of funny and ironic. And it actually makes sense now when you read all of those, times in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where he says essentially, don't close the door behind you. Right? Like, it's a very silly thing to shut yourself up in a wardrobe. And he says it like 4 or 5.
Oh,
like,
yeah, by the time so many times.
By the time that he says for the 6th time, you're like, okay, I think you might have, some kind of issue with wardrobes. So apparently, yes, he was claustrophobic and feared tight spaces even from childhood. So we had to make a couple of adjustments. Like in my original illustration, I had him sitting in the wardrobe, like with his brother and cousins. And then after talking with Douglas Gresham, we kind of moved him to be on the outside, and the cousins are sitting inside, and he's telling the story from there.
Oh yeah, that's so cool. Yeah, I didn't know that about him, so that's really neat. Phil and I talked about, when we were covering wardrobe, talked about, man, he really does mention not doing this a lot. Is he trying to be funny, or is he trying to like warn kids not to do this? But it's we didn't even consider the fact that he himself was the one who was really bothered by it.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's really cool. So just got a couple more questions for you here, Lina. One of the things we ask all the people who come on our show is we love that, there's so much diversity in these 7 books that we all love so much. And, there's not really a clear winner of which one's the most popular. So my question to you is, which book in the series is your favorite and why?
Yeah, so actually, The Horse and His Boy is my current favorite.
Okay.
It probably wasn't my favorite the first time that I read it. I think it was a little confusing at first because it's the only book where the main characters don't come from our world into Narnia, I believe. They're characters that already live in Narnia. And the Pevensies are mentioned a few times, but they're kind of off to the side. But after I read the book a couple of times, I really took a liking to the main characters, Aravis and Shasta. They both come from like these really difficult backgrounds, right? So like Shasta, I don't know. Are you the one that's read the book or not?
So actually both Phil and I have not read. This is the only book I think I read it as a kid. I've mentioned this before. There's definitely very foggy parts of it, but it's the only one I have not reread as an adult, but you're free to still talk about it. Phil hasn't read any past what we've already covered.
That's funny. Well, it actually took me about 3 times to really like this book. But
Okay.
like I was saying, so Shasta, he sort of comes from this background where he's like an adopted child, but he's really like a servant. And then Aravis is a young girl running away from a forced marriage.
Hmm.
But I just love their big personalities. They're very independent. They're always arguing, and it's just so funny. And then you have the talking horses. Um, and it's really just fun listening to them. But I think that my favorite part of the book was just seeing how all of the seemingly unrelated tragedies and incidences that happen to them sort of come together, and in the end you find out that there was a purpose for everything. And in Through the Wardrobe, my book, I have like a short summary of each of the books. And it took me a long time to figure out the summary for The Horse and His Boy. So I was rereading it for like the 10th time, and then I came across the scene where Aslan is sort of explaining, like, Shasta's complaining about all the things that have happened to him,
Hmm.
and Aslan is like, well, this happened for this reason, and that happened and then like everything sort of clicks together, and you get this bird's eye view. And so my summary of that book, in my book, is essentially the worst moments of your life were only leading you to become the person you were meant to be. And I thought that that was a good way to even sum up C.S. Lewis's own life and journey. So like all of the things that he went through, the good, the bad, and the difficult, they all led him to eventually write his books and, of course, the Chronicles of Narnia.
That is
So.
really great. Yeah, it makes me excited to dive into that book because it's so fun to hear, because we've had people come on the show and again say that Horse and His Boy is their favorite, and then other people, we usually don't ask people what their least favorite is, but then after we're done recording, people are like, "Oh, I can't stand The Horse and His Boy," and so it's. That's what's so fun about these books is people are all over the place. There's not like one clear winner, and so what are your once this book? Obviously, we've heard about it. There was a lot of research and a lot of work that led up to this book. So I'd love to just ask, what are some of your future plans now that this book is being released?
Well, I'm always trying to write something new. Right now, I'm trying to figure out my next picture book biography. I have a couple of people in mind, but I'm not really sure who it's going to be, so I don't really want to say just yet.
Sure.
But I definitely love to write some more biographies about really interesting people, maybe some fiction, maybe even something for older children, kind of playing around with ideas. I think it would be fun to maybe illustrate a work by another author, but I'm not sure. Yeah, like I haven't done it yet. So I don't know how I would feel. I probably would depend on the story, but I'm kind of used to like having control over the whole thing.
Sure, yeah.
But I think that would be fun to try to do, maybe like some chapter books or some book covers, but definitely working on a couple of book ideas that I have in mind right now.
That's great. I'm looking forward to those. By how much I've loved Through the Wardrobe, I can't wait to see what you're doing next.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Well, my final question for you, and I'm sure it's one that many of our listeners want to hear you answer, which is that where can we find and purchase your book at?
Sure. Well, you can find Through the Wardrobe, How C.S. Lewis Created Narnia, just about anywhere online, wherever books are sold. My publisher is HarperCollins, so if you go on their website, harpercollins.com, they have a couple of links there, or you can just call your independent bookstore. I think these days especially, it's important to support our local businesses.
Yeah.
So if you have a local independent bookstore, maybe give them a call and ask them to order it for you. It's also available on a website called bookshop.org. So that's a website that actually helps out your local bookstore and gives them a small percentage if you just want to order through that website. And sometimes the independent bookstores go through that site too. And it's also available on barnesandnoble.com, Books A Million, Amazon, of course, wherever books are sold, yeah. And if you do like the book, please leave a review on Amazon or Goodreads. But yeah, it's available just about anywhere.
That's really cool. I actually didn't know anything about Bookshop, and so I'll have to check that out. I love supporting my local bookstore, and so especially in these times, I know it's really important, and so I'll have to check out that website.
Yeah, and it's kind of taken off, in the last couple of months because a lot of these independent stores have had to sort of switch to a online platform.
Yeah.
And that's a site that seems to be one that they're all praising these days.
Well, that's great.
So,
yeah, that's cool. I'm sure a lot of our listeners will be interested in that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Lina, thank you so much for being on our show and telling us more about your book. It really is, I can't praise it enough. It was a really enjoyable read, and I know a lot of our listeners will enjoy it as well, too. Any last thoughts before we go?
No, other than I just had a lot of fun chatting, and I hope, people check out the book, and maybe you can contact me on Twitter or Instagram at Lina Maslo and let me know what you think. I'd love to hear people's thoughts about, what they thought of the book.
Yeah. Well, then thank you just one final time, because this really has been a great conversation. So thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Daniel.
All right, well, this episode was made possible by our patrons over at patreon.com. If you'd like to support the show, you can listen to a bonus episode each month along with other rewards. Special thanks goes out to Elias Dean, Madeline Heising, Hannah Anderson, John Marr, and Emily Margaret for supporting us at the Care Paravel level. You can follow us into Narnia on our Twitter or Facebook pages, and if you have any feedback, you can email us at thenarniapodcast@gmail.com, or just leave us a voicemail at 406-646-6733. As always, we would appreciate a review over on Apple Podcasts, as this helps other listeners find the show. Thank you again for coming along on this journey, and we will be back next time with our long-awaited discussion of the Prince Caspian movie.